Perhaps your most sacred wound is not a memory you carry, but a contract you are still signing. The unconscious agreement that organized your life before you could speak its terms. You learned early that belonging arrived when you made yourself smaller. When you anticipated the weather of others, when you carried what they could not afford to feel. Shame did not enter loudly. It seeped in as responsibility. Conditional affection disguised itself as virtue. And you mistook endurance for goodness because it kept you included. This is not generosity. It is not love. It is a structure older than memory, a role assumed before consent. You were rewarded not for being but for adjusting. Love arrived when you erased the sharp edges of truth. When you explained what should not have required explanation. When you betrayed an inner boundary to keep the outer bond intact. This is how power is transferred in families without anyone naming it. Not by force but by expectation. Not by command but by silence. And when this pattern repeats beyond the family, it is no accident. The psyche recognizes familiar architecture and moves into it as if returning home. The cost of this arrangement is rarely paid all at once. It is extracted gradually, like fatigue that has no clear source. A resentment you do not allow yourself to feel because feeling it would threaten the image that kept you safe. Identity thins. Authority drains. You begin to exist as function rather than presence. Each repetition strengthens the pattern, because repetition itself is the psyche's way of insisting on recognition. What you call exhaustion is often the soul's refusal to continue paying for a belonging that requires self-erasure. Yet the repetition persists because the unconscious prefers a known suffering to an unknown freedom. Here the night air settles against stone. The fire has burned low. Outside, frost tightens its grip on the ground, and the world holds still without reassurance. You believed your role was chosen because of your empathy. But the psyche was actually organizing around a deeper mechanism, a complex formed where love and fear fused. The consequence was loyalty that outlived its usefulness. The mechanism was possession by a role that promised safety in exchange for compliance. You became the bearer of equilibrium for others and in doing so, surrendered your own center. This is not pathology. It is economy. The family system conserved energy by assigning its unprocessed weight to the one most capable of carrying it. The price was your authority quietly postponed. In the language of the alchemists, this is the darkening, not a dramatic collapse but a slow blackening of meaning. Nigredo is not chaos. It is a moment when what once worked no longer yields life. You feel it as heaviness, as repetition without renewal. The empathic one often enters this stage without rebellion, because rebellion would violate the contract. Instead, you grow tired in ways sleep cannot repair. You begin to sense that your kindness has become compulsory, that your morality has been conscripted into service of something that does not know your name. Consider the figure of Persephone. Taken not by brute force alone, but by the inevitability of descent. Her abduction is also an initiation. The underworld does not ask for permission. It reveals what was hidden beneath the surface of fertility in the psyche. Descent arrives when the old identity can no longer sustain the weight placed upon it. The empath is drawn downward not because they are weak, but because they have been used as a bridge for too long. The underworld here is not depression. It is confrontation with the truth of the contract. Ash settles where fire once flared. The smell of iron lingers in the cold. You believed your explanations preserved harmony. But the psyche was actually maintaining a hierarchy formed by unconscious agreement. The consequence was the loss of your capacity to say no without guilt. The mechanism was projection. Others placed their unowned need and fragility into you, and you accepted it because it gave you a place. Over time, the persona inflated around usefulness. You became indispensable and therefore replaceable. Authority cannot emerge where existence must be justified. This is where resentment begins to ferment, though you may call it sadness or confusion. Resentment is not moral failure. It is information. It signals that an inner boundary has been crossed too often without acknowledgement. Yet the empath is trained to turn this signal inward, to accuse themselves of hardness, when the psyche is simply withdrawing consent. The repetition compulsion tightens because leaving the role would feel like betrayal, and betrayal threatens exile. The child within still believes that withdrawal of service equals withdrawal of love. A distant owl moves through the dark, unseen. Its call cutting the air once and then gone. Albedo does not arrive as relief. It arrives as clarity. And it burns. The whitening is the moment you see the contract without decoration. You recognize that permission to exist was never meant to be conditional, and that the condition itself was a mechanism of control. This recognition does not immediately free you. It isolates you. To see clearly is to step out of the shared dream. And shared dreams do not forgive easily. You may feel colder, more alone, less certain of how to move. This is not regression. It is the withdrawal of projection. What was once glued together by expectation begins to separate into its proper parts. You believed your silence would keep you safe. But the psyche was actually preparing a threshold. The consequence was loneliness that felt sharper than before. The mechanism was the dissolution of an unconscious contract that had organized your relationships. When the contract loses its grip, those who depended on it feel threatened, though they may not know why. Their anxiety is not evidence that you are wrong. It is evidence that the structure is failing. In Egyptian myth, the heart is weighed against a feather, not judged by intention but by density. A heart made heavy by unowned burdens cannot pass unchanged. The empath's heart often carries more than its share, not because it is stronger, but because it was never allowed to be light. Albedo is the removal of what does not belong. It feels like loss because the psyche confuses weight with worth. The firelight flickers, revealing walls etched by time, then recedes. As the whitening continues, a new danger appears. The temptation to moralize the insight, to declare oneself superior for seeing what others cannot. This too is a trap. Authority does not arise from opposition. It arises from integration. Rubedo, the reddening, is not triumph. It is embodiment. The self does not argue for its existence. It occupies space and the space reorganizes around it. Boundaries here are not acts of defiance. They are conditions of being. They do not negotiate. They simply are. You believed power would arrive when others understood you. But the psyche was moving toward a quieter seat. The consequence of waiting for recognition was perpetual delay. The mechanism was identification with the role of explainer, which kept you oriented toward the other's gaze. When this identification loosens, something unfamiliar emerges. The capacity to remain unmoved by misunderstanding. This is not indifference. It is gravity. Red appears not as flame, but as warmth returning to the blood. Life flows back into places long held in suspension. Authority here is not loud. It is felt as a reduction of urgency. The need to justify evaporates. The family script loses its hold because it no longer finds purchase. The empath does not leave in anger. They remain but as themselves. And this changes the field more profoundly than departure ever could. Snow begins to fall outside, soundless, each flake distinct, altering the landscape without announcement. The collective unconscious shifts not through slogans or movements, but through countless such withdrawals of consent. When those who carried the unspoken weight set it down, the old hierarchies falter. Not because they are attacked, but because they are no longer fed. What is coming is not a promise. It is a convergence. The accumulated fatigue of those who have served as emotional infrastructure reaches a threshold. The psyche responds as it always does when a pattern exhausts itself. It reallocates energy. Power moves to where it can be held without distortion. This is not hope. It is inevitability. The self does not celebrate its return. It simply takes the seat that was always meant for it. The room grows quiet. Not with relief but with finality. The contract dissolves without ceremony. And what remains no longer asks to be explained. What remains does not announce itself. It does not replace one role with another. It does not rush to fill the silence left behind. It waits because it has waited before, longer than the family memory, longer than the habits that mistook usefulness for love. The psyche, when no longer compelled to perform, turns inward with a different quality of attention. Not the vigilance that scans for threat, but a steadier orientation. Like an eye adjusting to low light, you begin to notice how often your presence once bent toward others before it ever settled into itself. How your body learned to lean forward, to preempt, to soften before impact. These gestures were not chosen. They were trained. And training, once it has served its purpose, must be unlearned through absence rather than effort. You believed closeness required constant attunement. But the psyche was actually confusing proximity with survival. The consequence was intimacy that never reached rest. The mechanism was an early association between being needed and being allowed to stay. When this association loosens, something disorienting occurs. Relationships begin to reveal their true structure. Those built on mutual presence adjust. Those built on extraction destabilize. This is not punishment. It is exposure. The night deepens. Somewhere beyond the walls, a river moves beneath ice. Unheard, unhurried. The empath often imagines that if they withdraw their labor, collapse will follow. This fantasy is part of the contract. It keeps the carrier bound by a sense of catastrophic responsibility. Yet when withdrawal occurs, the world does not end. Instead, gaps appear. Awkwardness surfaces. Others must feel what they avoided. The psyche learns through consequence, not explanation. And this learning is resisted most fiercely by those who benefited from your unspoken work. Here the image of Orpheus returns, not as the artist who charms the underworld, but as the one who must learn when not to turn back. His loss is not caused by love, but by doubt in the law of descent. The empath too is tempted to look back, to re-enter the old role, to soothe the discomfort that follows withdrawal. But turning back restores the contract. Authority dissolves the moment reassurance is offered in place of presence. A thin layer of ash coats the hearth, pale against the dark stone. You believed loyalty was proven by endurance. But the psyche was testing whether loyalty to the self could survive disapproval. The consequence of choosing endurance was a slow erosion of inner trust. The mechanism was identification with morality as a shield against abandonment. When morality is used to override instinct, it becomes an instrument of repression. The shadow grows not because it is evil, but because it is excluded. As this exclusion becomes visible, dreams often change. Rooms appear with doors you did not know existed. Houses with corridors that lead nowhere, then suddenly open onto unfamiliar landscapes. These are not messages to be decoded like riddles. They are compensations. The unconscious is rebalancing a life that has been lived too far on one side. The empath has dwelt in closeness without freedom, in care without choice. The psyche answers with images of thresholds. Salt gathers on the tongue in the cold air. Sharp awakening. Albedo continues its work by stripping language of its excess. You speak less, not from withdrawal, but from accuracy. Words are chosen because they are true, not because they are soothing. Silence becomes possible without panic. This is often misread by others as distance, even cruelty. But cruelty requires intention. What they encounter instead is neutrality. And neutrality feels hostile to those accustomed to being mirrored. You believed being understood was necessary for peace. But the psyche was moving toward a different equilibrium. The consequence of waiting for understanding was perpetual exposure. The mechanism was projection of authority onto the other, who became judge and witness of your legitimacy. When this projection retracts, misunderstanding loses its power. It may still sting, but it no longer dictates movement. In the Gnostic image, the archons rule by imitation. They claim authority by mimicking the forms of the true God, but they cannot create. They can only demand. In the psyche, such false authorities appear as voices that insist you must justify your existence. They speak in the language of obligation, of debt, of roles that must be maintained. When the empath ceases to answer these voices, they do not disappear at once. They weaken. Their power was never intrinsic. It was borrowed. The fire is fed again. Not with urgency but with measure. Flame steadies. Rubedo approaches quietly. It does not arrive as revelation. It manifests as a subtle redistribution of energy. You find yourself less compelled to rescue conversations, less drawn to fill pauses, less inclined to explain your absence. This is not withdrawal into isolation. It is relocation. The center moves from the perimeter to the core, from reaction to presence. You believed authority required assertion. But the psyche was cultivating weight. The consequence of assertion without weight was resistance. The mechanism was persona inflation, an attempt to appear solid without being rooted. True authority does not push. It rests. Others feel it as limit, not as force. Blood warmth returns to the hands. The body recognizes itself again. Here the image of Jacob wrestling emerges not as a moral lesson, but as a psychological fact. The struggle is not with an external opponent. It is with the last identification that insists on being proven. The wound remains, a limp that never fully heals. But the name changes. Identity shifts from role to self. This change cannot be undone by accusation or nostalgia. It is registered too deeply. Those who once accessed you through guilt find the path closed, not barricaded, simply gone. They may circle, searching for the familiar opening. They may accuse you of coldness, of betrayal, of having changed. They are not entirely wrong. Change has occurred. But it is not the change they fear. It is the end of an agreement that required your diminishment. Frost creeps along the window's edge, intricate, indifferent. The collective unconscious responds to such individual shifts cumulatively. When enough carriers withdraw their surplus labor, systems strain. Not because the empath was the only support, but because their presence masked imbalance. What appears as crisis is often the first honest signal a system has produced in years. Power does not move to the empath because they seek it. It moves because it can no longer remain where it was artificially propped. You believed your sensitivity made you vulnerable to domination. But the psyche was revealing its opposite potential. The consequence of denying this potential was chronic submission. The mechanism was shadow identification. Power was split off and projected onto others, who then appeared overwhelming. When reclaimed, power does not become aggression. It becomes containment. The night holds steady. Stars emerge between clouds, distant, unmoved by human arrangement. As this containment stabilizes, the need to narrate your transformation fades. There is nothing to convince, nothing to demonstrate. The empath often mistakes this quiet for emptiness. It is not empty. It is uncolonized for the first time. The inner space is not immediately offered for use. Here at this threshold many hesitate. The old reflex reaches for a familiar role, a familiar ache. But the body no longer responds as it once did. The sensation is different, heavier, more grounded, less urgent. Authority has weight because it is connected to reality rather than approval. The furnace cools slowly, metal settling into form. This is not an ending. It is a seating. The self sits without ceremony, without proclamation. It does not need witnesses. The family script, deprived of participation, loses coherence. It may persist elsewhere, enacted by others, but it no longer accesses you. The door remains, but the lock has changed. The change announces itself most clearly not in conflict, but in what no longer happens. The phone remains untouched longer. Explanations that once assembled themselves automatically now fail to form. The body does not lean forward. It stays where it is. This absence is not emptiness. It is density. Something has settled that does not require motion to justify itself. The psyche, having withdrawn from the old economy, begins to register subtler signals. You notice how often others once approached you already leaning, already expecting accommodation, how quickly they filled the space you left open. These movements were learned responses to your former availability. When that availability recedes, confusion follows. Not rage at first, but disorientation. The familiar map no longer corresponds to the terrain. You believed your presence was interchangeable, but the psyche was revealing its irreplaceability. The consequence of believing yourself interchangeable was chronic overextension. The mechanism was self-erasure disguised as humility. When the erasure stops, the system that depended on it falters. This is not cruelty. It is recalibration. A wind passes through the trees outside. Pine needles whispering against one another. A sound that carries without intent. Here the image of Odysseus surfaces, not as the cunning hero, but as the one who learns to refuse the call of false homes. Each island offers rest at the price of forgetting. Each return to the old role promises relief, familiarity, a softening of tension. But the psyche remembers the cost. The empath learns to endure the ache of incompletion rather than surrender the core again. This endurance is not willpower. It is orientation. As Rubedo deepens, the opposites draw closer without collapsing. Love remains, but fear no longer governs it. Loyalty persists, but it is no longer purchased through self-betrayal. Kindness survives, stripped of compulsion. Desire and disgust sit nearer, no longer forced apart by moral panic. This proximity creates heat, not chaos but transformation. Iron warms in the furnace, glowing not white but red, malleable without losing strength. You believed boundaries were acts you performed, but the psyche was forming them as states of being. The consequence of treating boundaries as actions was exhaustion. The mechanism was constant vigilance, watching, adjusting, enforcing. When boundaries become ontological, they require no defense. They are felt by others as limit before they are spoken. This limit does not argue. It does not explain. It simply redirects movement. Those accustomed to negotiating access experience this as abrupt. They may escalate, not through overt domination but through appeals to memory, obligation, shared history. These appeals once worked because they activated the old contract. Now they encounter something else. Not resistance. But wait. The appeal falls flat like a sound absorbed by thick walls. The night sky clears. Constellations hold their positions. Ancient arrangements indifferent to human urgency. You believed confrontation would be necessary. But the psyche chose erosion. The consequence of expecting confrontation was unnecessary dread. The mechanism was projection of aggression onto the self's return. When authority emerges quietly, confrontation becomes optional. Many conflicts resolve themselves through lack of engagement. Others never begin. Here the image of Narcissus must be corrected. He is not destroyed by self-love, but by mistaking reflection for relation. The empath's earlier life inverted this error, mistaking relation for self. Now the mirror is reclaimed without fixation. You can see yourself without falling in. Presence replaces performance. Dreams continue to shift. You stand at thresholds without urgency. Doors open that lead not to others' rooms, but to landscapes unmarked by obligation. Fields without fences, forests where paths appear only as you walk. These images are not invitations. They are confirmations. The psyche registers that choice has returned. Ash is swept aside, revealing stone beneath, cool and intact. You believed rest would arrive after resolution. But the psyche introduces rest as a precondition. The consequence of postponing rest was chronic depletion. The mechanism was tying permission to stop to external validation. When rest is taken without explanation, the body responds with unfamiliar relief, tinged with grief for how long it was denied. This grief must be allowed its density. It is not self-pity. It is mourning for a life lived in partial exile from itself. Mourning completes the alchemical process. Without it, bitterness seeps in. With it, red deepens into something enduring. The Bible's image of Job sits here not as a moral lesson, but as a psychological landscape. Everything that organized his identity collapses without explanation. Friends arrive to interpret, to assign meaning, to restore order through speech. Job refuses their frameworks. He demands encounter, not justification. When encounter arrives, it does not explain. It overwhelms. Authority returns not as reward, but as recognition of scale. The empath, too, learns that explanations are small compared to reality. Snow piles silently at the base of the door, insulating rather than blocking. You believed being seen would complete the process. But the psyche closes the circle without witnesses. The consequence of seeking to be seen was renewed exposure. The mechanism was reliance on external mirrors to confirm inner shifts. When the mirror is internal, visibility becomes optional. You can be unknown and intact. At this stage, power appears in unexpected places. In the ability to leave conversations unfinished. In the refusal to correct misinterpretations. In the capacity to let others carry their own confusion. These acts would once have felt like abandonment. Now they feel proportionate. The scale has changed. Salt crystallizes where moisture evaporates. Residue marking what has passed through. The collective movement accelerates through such individual recalibrations. Institutions, families, relationships reorganize not through ideology, but through absence of compliance. Those who once depended on emotional labor find themselves confronting their own unprocessed material. Some adapt. Some harden. The psyche does not negotiate outcomes. It responds to pressure with transformation or fracture. You believed empathy destined you for perpetual service. But the psyche was refining empathy into perception. The consequence of conflating empathy with service was self-loss. The mechanism was shadowing power behind morality. When perception remains without service, empathy becomes discerning. You feel without absorbing. You witness without carrying. The fire settles into embers. Steady heat without flare. This discernment reshapes attraction. You are less drawn to intensity for its own sake. Less compelled by familiarity masquerading as depth. What once felt magnetic now appears repetitive. What once seemed dull reveals stability. This is not preference changing. It is orientation clarifying. Here the Egyptian image returns. Osiris, dismembered, scattered, then reassembled. The empath's psyche underwent a similar fragmentation through years of role-based living. Reassembly does not restore the old form. It produces a new coherence. The pieces fit differently. The center holds. As this coherence stabilizes, the future loses its grip. Not because it is bleak, but because anticipation no longer governs behavior. Authority, seated in the present, does not rush toward outcome. It allows consequence to unfold. A faint light appears at the horizon, not dawn, but reflection. Sky brightening imperceptibly. The family script, deprived of your participation, begins to loop elsewhere. You may observe it repeating through others, unchanged. This observation no longer pulls you in. Compassion may arise, but it does not translate into intervention. To intervene would be to re-enter the economy. The self does not subsidize structures that refuse to evolve. You believed departure was the only escape. But the psyche chose position. Remaining without compliance alters the field more decisively than leaving ever could. Your presence becomes diagnostic. Others feel exposed by it. Though you say nothing, this exposure is not intentional. It is structural. Frost loosens as temperature shifts. Droplets forming, then falling. As time accumulates, these individual seedings accumulate not as a movement, not as a shared language, but as a redistribution of psychic labor. Those who carried too much set it down. Those who avoided carrying feel the weight. Power shifts not through conquest but through rebalancing. There is no celebration, no announcement, only a new arrangement that feels inevitable once it arrives. What follows is not resolution in the dramatic sense. It is not the tying of threads or the sealing of meaning. It is the stabilization of a center that no longer seeks completion outside itself. The The psyche, once freed from the compulsion to serve as connective tissue for others, begins to operate according to a different gravity. Things fall where they belong. Not quickly, not gently, but accurately. You notice how decisions once accompanied by hesitation now arrive without ceremony. Not because certainty has increased, but because internal argument has quieted. The old debate, whether you are allowed, whether you are justified, whether you will be forgiven, no longer governs movement. These questions belong to a structure that required your doubt in order to function. When the structure dissolves, the questions lose their relevance. The room holds a deeper stillness now. Not the brittle quiet of restraint, but the dense silence of something settled. Outside, the last of the snow melts into dark earth, absorbed without comment. You believed power would feel like expansion. But the psyche delivers it as compression. Life becomes smaller, more contained, yet more real. Fewer relationships. Fewer explanations. Fewer obligations. What remains carries weight. This reduction is not loss. It is distillation. The excess that once masked imbalance has burned away. You believed compassion required availability. But the psyche reveals a more exacting form. Compassion that does not dissolve the self. Compassion that does not rescue, does not mediate, does not absorb. This compassion observes. It allows consequence. It does not interfere with the maturation of others' suffering. Such restraint can look like coldness to those accustomed to being spared themselves. Here the image of the burning bush emerges, not as miracle but as paradox. Fire that does not consume. Presence that does not deplete. Authority that does not dominate. The empaths' return to self resembles this phenomenon. You are there, unmistakably. Yet no longer used as fuel. Those who approach with expectation find nothing to take. Those who approach without agenda encounter warmth. Ash cools completely. What remains is form. You believed your history would continue to define you. But the psyche relocates history into background. Memory remains, but it no longer dictates posture. The body unlearns its forward lean. Muscles soften in places long held tight. This change is not cosmetic. It signals a new orientation toward time. The past loses its leverage. The future loses its pull. The present becomes sufficient. In this sufficiency, fear shifts. It does not disappear. It becomes proportionate. Fear returns to its rightful place as signal, not master. Without fear governing belonging, choices become simpler, though not easier. You may disappoint. You may be misunderstood. These outcomes no longer carry existential threat. The wind dies down. Night settles fully, clear and uncompromising. You believe the collective shift would announce itself through events. But the psyche moves first through absence. Old narratives lose traction. Appeals that once worked fall flat. Emotional economies that relied on your participation collapse quietly. There is confusion, yes. There is resistance. But there is also adaptation. Those capable of it reorganize. Those who cannot reveal themselves. This revelation is not your responsibility. It never was. Responsibility, in its original sense, is the capacity to respond. You now respond from self, not from role. Some calls receive no answer. Others receive a boundary instead of a bridge. This selectivity is not cruelty. It is precision. Here the Gnostic image returns one final time. The archons do not fall in battle. They starve. Deprived of belief, deprived of compliance, deprived of borrowed authority, they fade. In the psyche, the false gods were always dependent on your doubt. When doubt withdraws, they cannot sustain themselves. A single star brightens overhead. Fixed, unconcerned with witness. You believed meaning would arrive through affirmation. But the psyche anchors it in gravity. Meaning here is not uplifting. It is grounding. It does not promise. It holds. The self, once seated, does not require maintenance. It does not need to be defended. It simply remains. This remaining alters everything downstream. Relationships either recalibrate or fall away. Work reorganizes around capacity rather than obligation. Creativity returns in quieter forms. You may find yourself drawn to simplicity, to tasks that have clear edges and honest limits. This is not retreat. It is alignment. The empath's earlier life was spent negotiating access. The later life rests in position. From this position, influence emerges without effort. Others feel it and adjust. Some resent it. Some are relieved by it. None can ignore it entirely. The night air grows colder, sharper, clarifying. As the year turns, the collective unconscious does not celebrate. It does not announce a new era. It redistributes weight. Those long accustomed to caring for others set their burdens down. Those long protected from their own material begin to encounter it. This encounter is uneven, uncomfortable, and necessary. You are not here to lead it. You are not here to explain it. Your role is finished. What remains is presence. Presence without justification. Presence without apology. Presence without extraction. The family script attempts one final access. Perhaps through nostalgia, perhaps through accusation, perhaps through appeal to what once was. It finds no response. Not because you have hardened, but because there is nothing left to negotiate. The contract has ended. The system recognizes this, even if it cannot name it. The door remains open. No one stands in it. This is the authority that arrives when explanation ends. Not dominance, not control, but the unmovable fact of being seated in oneself. The psyche rests here, finally aligned with its own center. Nothing more is required.